You may have heard of mobility and stability when it comes to training, and you might think they're complete opposites, but I think they actually have a lot more overlap than you'd think. So first, let's start with a couple definitions. What is mobility and what is stability? Mobility is typically active motion, and then flexibility is more passive motion, which is typically how it's considered. I sort of disagree with this, but we'll get into it. Stability is allowing controlled motions and then minimizing unwanted motions, basically. So going back to flexibility. Flexibility typically involves more muscle. You can have active flexibility and you can have passive flexibility. Active flexibility is where you're using your opposite muscle group to stretch the opposite muscle group. So basically like your quad and your hamstrings are an easy example. So maybe you're using your quads to straighten out your leg to stretch your hamstrings. That's gonna be more active flexibility. Passive flexibility is like a typical hamstring stretch where you just use a strap and pull. So you're using an external force to stretch your muscle. Mobility includes flexibility, but it also considers the specific joint motion. So with the hamstrings, it crosses both the hip and the knee, where mobility, you're talking about a specific joint mobility. So it's just talking about the hip or just talking about the knee. Your joints will move in different ways based on the anatomy. So for example, your shoulder is gonna have a lot more motion than your elbow. It's just the way the joint is. The shoulder is a ball and socket joint. The elbow joint is more of a hinge joint. There are also two other things that, in my opinion, make up mobility. So you also wanna consider neurodynamics or nerve mobility, nerve movement, basically. You have a ton of different nerves in your body. They all start from your brain, go down your spinal column, and then exit out and branch out in all these crazy different ways. You can bias or put tension on different nerves in different ways with different movements, and you can mobilize them whether you're flossing them or tensioning them to improve their tolerance for different positions. Nerves also like blood flow, movement, and space, so you can also consider those things when working on specific nerve mobility stuff. And then mobility also considers end range control or end range strength. You want to be able to control the motion. This is where like the active flexibility comes in a little bit, but you want to control the joint throughout the full range of motion, and that'll help your body feel protected at those end ranges. And then that's kind of also where stability comes in with that end range strength. A lot of times with stability, you might think of some really big guy in the gym who can't move. That's more of like the stiffness. They got a lot of stability, right? So you want to balance the stability with the mobility to have optimal results, because you don't want to be too mobile. You don't want to be on the hypermobile spectrum where you have more motion than you can control. You want to be able to control the motion, and that'll help you reduce the risk of injury. You might also want to consider your natural tendencies. So some people might be a little bit more on the hypermobile spectrum, and genetically they have a little bit more laxity. That means that they want to bias their training probably a little bit more to the strengthening side of things, whether that's just general strength training or specific end range strength training. If you are a little bit more stiff, based on your lifestyle, based on just how your body is, then you might want to bias more of the mobility side of things or the stretching side of things. So you can do a little bit more passive stretching, a little bit more passive mobility, but then you always want to follow it up regardless of where you are with that end range strengthening. That way you can maintain the mobility gains that you just achieved with your stretching and your passive mobility work. So if you want to improve your mobility or stability around a certain joint, I do have prehab programs that include these types of things. Or if you want to follow along workout that kind of implements these concepts, I do have a split follow along workout if you're working towards your splits.